tonight. As we all know, we haven't been able to do many in-person events, so it's really nice to, our first big one, besides Candidates Night, we really have a great turnout. So, my name is Ellen Gogan. I know a lot of you, which is great. Welcome to our program on political discourse. And I'm just going to make a few announcements before we begin. Many of you know the League of Women Voters is interested in informing voters. And we have recordings of all the 4 different questions that are on the ballot. I think they're all confusing this year. And different leagues in Massachusetts have done forums. And what we do now, since we're all used to Zoom, we record them when we have a forum and share them with other leagues. So right now, they're all on the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts website, and I'm going to move them to Facebook on our Facebook page, League of Women Voters of Grafton, in a couple of days. I was waiting because I wanted to leave this program up as the first thing you see on Facebook. Now, most of you know we're nonpartisan. We take stands on issues, and we come to consensus. And we do support question 4, the safe driving one. I think you can tell this is being recorded by Grafton Cable, and we will have that link on our Facebook page. And of course, you can find it on the Grafton Cable TV website, and I think you probably all know they have a YouTube channel. So that's all I have to say, except to introduce Donna Williams, who's going to introduce our speaker. So thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. What a great crowd. This is so cool that you're all here. Thank you for coming. And so the question is, how worried should we be about the state of American politics today? And our speaker, we're so pleased to have Dr. Robert Boatwright with us, who is the chairman of the Political Science Department at Clark University. So before I introduce him, I do want to cover some logistics. So as Ellen said, the Grafton Community TV is filming this forum, and so the mics are important. If you have a question, we need to get the mic to you so your question can be part of the recording. So what we'll do is hold the questions because of this logistical issue with the mics. So if you hold your questions till the end, and then we'll get a mic to you as you ask your questions. And then, after Dr. Boatwright's presentation and your questions, we're going to pose a question to you. And that question is, what ideas do you have about follow-up programs to address these issues? So actually, what we'd like is for all of us to have a much more pleasant Thanksgiving dinner. So maybe we can come up with strategies to do that at a later program. Anyway, we will make this slide presentation available to you from your emails. We'll send you the slide presentation. There are lots of resources toward the end of it. And when we get your ideas about follow-up programming, we will have someone typing them into the computer, and rather than a whiteboard or a flip chart, we'll be able to see what your ideas are up here. And then we'll make sure we've reported them accurately. All right, so let me introduce Dr. Robert Boatwright. He is the professor of political science at Clark University in Worcester and teaches courses on American political behavior, political parties, campaigns and elections, interest groups, political participation, and political theory. And he is in charge of the department through this year, through 2022. His primary field of research is campaign finance, but he has written on a variety of other subjects, including congressional politics and elections, redistricting, and various aspects of jury service. In addition to his work at Clark, he's also the director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse Research Network, which is pretty cool, and that's at the University of Arizona. He is also the director of the Worcester Campaign Finance Project. He's taught at Clark since 2005. Before that, he taught at Swarthmore College and worked as a research fellow at the Campaign Finance Institute as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow and as a research associate at the American Judicature Society. Grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, received his BA from Carleton College, and received his PhD from the University of Chicago. Man, are we glad he's here. Great credentials. Rob, take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thanks to Marge and Donna for coming up with this idea. It's wonderful to be here. I was telling folks from the organization, I've spoken to League of Women Voters chapters in Vermont and New York and New Jersey before the pandemic, so I feel like I'm slowly making my way through the Northeast. So I'm a professor of political science. Lots of political scientists spend time doing things that we like to call science, measuring things, trying to come up with statistical relationships between stuff. But I feel like when you're in a moment like this, where developments in American politics seem in many ways unprecedented, it's kind of hard to measure things. That it's sometimes better to tell stories. So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to tell you 3 different stories that I think address where we're at. And the merits of telling stories, of course, is that they work for you if you want them to, but we don't sit and argue about whether they're fundamentally true, fundamentally false, anything like that. Instead, I offer these for your consideration. So, first of all, let me give you a little bit of background on myself. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio is kind of the land of forgotten presidents. There are actually more presidents from Ohio than I think any other state, but people have a hard time naming them. Conveniently, my mother was an American history teacher, and so when I was a little kid, I remember she had like a high school textbook of American history, and in the back, there were pictures of all of the presidents. So I want to talk to you tonight about presidents that you probably don't think about. If you had one of these books, you'll recall that in the late 19th century, there's this whole string of American presidents with really impressive facial hair. Just to go through them briefly, this is Rutherford B. Hayes, who was elected in 1876, grew up near Cleveland, Ohio. I once visited his home. Rutherford B. Hayes, the odd fact about Rutherford B. Hayes is that he was the last voluntary one-term president in American history. And if you go to his birthplace, they proudly talk about how this was a great achievement, that he voluntarily stepped away from the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes was followed in 1880 by this fellow here, James Garfield. And you may not be able to tell from his picture, but James Garfield was in many ways sort of the JFK of his era. He was seen as a young, super exciting guy who had a great agenda for change in America. Unfortunately, James Garfield was shot shortly after becoming president, and due to the incompetence of the doctors, he kind of languished in this very painful way for over a month before succumbing to his injuries. Garfield was followed by this fellow here, I got this slightly out of order, Grover Cleveland from New York. And Grover Cleveland, you may have read a little bit about during the Trump years, which I guess are still going on, right? Grover Cleveland was the only president in the United States history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was elected, he was defeated by this fellow, Benjamin Harrison, and he came back to the presidency a term later. Now, what is interesting about this era in American history is that we don't generally think about it as being a super exciting time, but in fact, what's striking about this time in American history is that the political parties are almost exactly evenly matched. We have a series of elections that are decided by a small fraction of the vote. Rutherford B. Hayes, in fact, was up until Hayes and Harrison, in fact, were up until recently the only presidents who were able to win the Electoral College yet also lose the popular vote. Americans at the time, this is 1876, this is the Electoral College breakdown. Here we have 1884, the year in which Grover Cleveland won. And you see a similar sort of Electoral College breakdown, right? Things are very, very narrow, evenly contested. Now, the striking thing about this era is that this is also the era prior to now in which American politics was the most polarized. I can show you, I have somewhere here a slide of this. This is a measure of polarization in Congress. You've probably seen things like this. To give you a quick and not overly technical explanation, these lines show the difference on roll call votes in Congress between the average Republican and the average Democrat. This red line is the House of Representatives, and the blue line is the Senate. So you can see that Congress was relatively evenly divided. Presidential elections were very, very close. And yet there was a huge difference between Republicans and Democrats in Congress. They couldn't agree on much of anything. So this was an interesting time in American politics, in part because people took this to be the norm. We had a long string of elections that looked kind of like this. And, I guess you're not supposed to speak up since you don't have microphones and we're on television. But when you take a look at this map, probably what strikes you when you look at it is that if you ignore the fact that all of those kind of tan places out west don't count, right? Because those were not states at the time, those are territories. Ignore that for a moment and just think about the contours of this map. And you'll notice a couple things. First of all, the nature of the division looks a lot like the division we see today, right? There are a lot of states that we now call blue states that are red states in this picture, and conversely, a lot of those blue states are places that we refer to as red states today. Same thing happens in 1888, and then to show you that I'm not making this up, right? Here's the here's the electoral votes in 2012. Right, things are almost exactly inverted in terms of which party represents New England, which party represents the South, but there's the same basic kind of division between the parties. So that's one story about why politics of that era sounded a little bit like today's politics. Let me tell you a few other things about how elections played out during this time. The political parties fought tooth and nail with each other about things like race, morality, immigration. These were really the hot button issues. Presidential campaigns were really, really bitter. All sorts of accusations being flung about the personal lives of individual candidates. And ultimately, you can perhaps predict that because elections at this time were so narrow, as far as we can tell, and we don't have public opinion surveys or anything like this from this era, but when you read the newspapers, you can see that Americans were suspicious of the political process itself. There were all sorts of allegations of ballot box stuffing, all sorts of arguments that elections were being rigged. Things were really pretty nasty. And they were nasty despite the fact that when you look back on American history, it's hard to argue that the things people thought about in the 1880s were super consequential for American history overall. That is, we don't spend a lot of time figuring out whether important issues were decided in the election of 1884, 1888, anything of that sort. So that's one way in which we can think about our elections today, that they are somewhat like those elections. And this is important for a variety of reasons, right? It's important in one case because we can learn from the polarization of this era, right? We've been here before. The moment at which we're at now, where it seems like Democrats and Republicans are opposed to each other and everything, is not entirely new. But here's another interesting kind of comparison. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not like a causal story. I'm not saying that political polarization causes inequality, but if you look at these lines, this is suspicious, right? This black line here, that's the same thing you saw in those other graphs, right? That is the distance between Democrats and Republicans in Congress. A lot of distance back in the early years of the 20th century. I don't have that on the graph here, but same thing goes in the late 19th century. And then today, right? Similar distances between the parties. And this red line here is a measure of the percentage of wealth that went to the people in the top 1%. There are a lot of different indicators of this. You may have heard of the Gini coefficient, for instance. But what this seems to indicate is that in moments when our political parties don't get along, we also historically have had a very unequal society. These are moments like today, where it seems like more and more wealth is in the hands of the people at the very top of the income distribution. But what I want to emphasize about this era, really, is that Americans at this time didn't necessarily see any way out. If you read journalists of the 1880s, early 1890s, they were resigned to believing that this is how American elections were going to go. But in reality, a different kind of thing was brewing, and again, you can see this here. If you look at the Electoral College map, in 1892, this guy, James Weaver, runs as the candidate of the Populist Party. And Weaver organizes this movement on behalf of people in farming areas of the United States, arguing that they were being left behind, that the government was not paying attention to the kind of beliefs that they had. It's hard to map the kind of argument that Weaver made onto politics today. I know it probably sounds to you that in the way I'm presenting this, I'm comparing this guy to Donald Trump, which I'm not exactly doing. Right? His positions were, I think, substantially more to the left than Donald Trump's are. But he appealed to people using the sort of language that Donald Trump has used, right? Arguing that these rich elites on the East Coast were not paying attention to people in the farming areas of the country, that these were regular Americans who were being left behind. So something is brewing, despite what appeared to be a period of party gridlock. This guy here, William Jennings Bryan, comes along a couple elections later. And William Jennings Bryan does not win any elections, but he is the candidate of his party, of the Democratic Party, for 3 elections in a row. He fundamentally changes what the Democratic Party is about, even though he is a loser. You'll see William Jennings Bryan is here, the candidate of the Democratic Party. He gets clobbered, right? So it's not the case that the guy making this sort of populist appeal wins any elections. But over the next few decades, his party became much more like him. And by 1912, the ideas that had kind of floated around in this populist movement become a part of American politics. Theodore Roosevelt runs for office in 1912 as a candidate of the Bull Moose Party. You see what the Bull Moose Party wanted to do in this picture here, right? The idea was that they would take stuff from the Democrats and take stuff from the Republicans, figure out a new sort of agenda. And this is exactly what they do. This is Theodore Roosevelt's platform when he ran for president in 1912. And you can see that this is a platform that, number one, was aimed at the same kinds of economic concerns that the populists had spoken about. And that, number two, you read this, and it seems like it is a recipe for the progressive, what people call themselves progressives today. And that much of this was really quite successful. So in the early 20th century, people running as describing themselves as progressives, some of them in the Republican Party, some of them in the Democratic Party, made radical changes to American government. The introduction of the direct primary, the introduction of nonpartisan elections in states such as Massachusetts, the introduction of direct democracy, right? All of these ballot questions that you were talking about earlier. All sorts of changes implemented by the progressives designed to fundamentally change our political system. In addition, progressives argued for a variety of other redistributive measures, for breaking up railroad monopolies and the other sorts of monopolies that enabled people, in the upper 1% to get so wealthy. And I don't want to frame this as being entirely like a left-wing agenda today. Some of the agenda items of progressives were things like prohibition, right, which are different than our concerns today. And I also, in the interest of fairness, want to point out that the thing that's really missing among all of these is anything having to do with race. There are some people who argue that this movement was successful in large part because people on what you would call the left at the time decided for the time being to stop fighting about race. So I don't want you to think that this is something that is exactly analogous to the left in America today. But the point I want to make is that our political system has been through moments like this before, where it seemed like the parties were deadlocked, and things can change very, very radically in a very, very short amount of time. Right? We have a history that tells us this. Now, possibly this is a nice story, right? It's a story that suggests that the sort of gridlock we see in Washington, the nasty conflicts that we see between Democrats and Republicans today, that there's some natural thing in our political system that can solve this, that we can just sit around and stuff will change, that we have a remarkably flexible political system. I don't know if that is true or not, but that's a lesson we can take from this. We could also perhaps study the tactics of people who are involved in these movements and try to learn things, right? I have to admit, the funny thing I was thinking about as I was starting this talk, I'm woefully ignorant of the history of the League of Women Voters. But since women got the vote in 1920, I would guess that the League of Women Voters probably has its roots in the same sort of progressive movement. So things can change very quickly. And the image that we have today of the political parties, that there's the Democrats and they stand for this thing, and there's the Republicans and they stand for this thing, Republicans are there, Democrats are there, all of these things mask massive changes within our political system, and sooner or later these changes may burst forth the way they did in the late 19th century. So that's one story I would offer you. I offer you that story with the acknowledgement that this is a very imprecise analogy, but it is to say that we shouldn't sit here and say things are going to be like this forever. Okay, that's story number one. Story number two. More graphs for you, right? Here's another picture of what political polarization looks like. So take a look at all of these dots here, right? Those red dots, those are Republican members of Congress. These blue dots are Democratic members of Congress. This is every member of Congress in the 1950s in each election cycle. That is, if you served in Congress for 5 different election cycles in the 1950s, there are 5 dots up there for you, and so on. So this line here is a measure of ideology. I can get into the specifics on you for you if you want, but it's super complicated. But basically what your takeaway should be is that people are more conservative the higher up they go on that scale, and more liberal the lower they go on this scale. And over here, this line at the bottom, this is the district presidential vote for the Democratic candidate. So if members of Congress were perfectly responsive to the voters, and if we were to assume, and this is like a big assumption, but if we were to assume that more Republican districts were more conservative, then we would argue that a system like this, where there was a neat little line you could draw, was a system in which the representative was perfectly responsive to his or her constituents. That is, we'd expect Democrats over here, like whoever that is, right, to be very, very liberal because they were representing their voters, right? They were doing a good job of representing people in a heavily Democratic district, and we would expect the Republicans way up there, again, to be good representatives, right? You're more conservative if you represent more conservative voters, right? So some assumptions, but that's one story we can tell. So this is the Congress of the 1950s. And I got to admit, it doesn't look that bad, right? In a couple ways, right? You could draw that little diagonal line. You could argue that this was a Congress that was representative of the American people. And you could also say, look, there's some Republicans who are just like some Democrats, right? It's true that on average Republicans are more conservative than Democrats, but there's a lot of overlap, right? There are liberal Republicans in kind of liberal places. There are conservative Democrats in kind of conservative places. And there are a few instances where it looks like you've got Republicans who are more liberal than some Democrats. So here's a story of our politics over the last 70 years. And I've perfected these slides, so I want you to just admire how this happens. 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000 teens, right? This is what has happened in our political system. And I gotta say, I know this is a nonpartisan talk, so I do not say this as a partisan. This is one of the things that political scientists kind of struggle with, it looks to me on this map like the Democratic Party is more heterogeneous than the Republican Party, right? Democrats are more diverse in terms of their ideological views, and they also seem to represent the voters a little bit better than Republicans. That is, in more conservative places, when you do have Democrats elected, you have more conservative Democrats. Republicans are kind of all clustered in a much more narrow area. So this is what has happened in our politics over the past 70 years. Now, why has all of this happened? Well, again, remember this is a story, so I'm not arguing that one thing causes the other, right? It's a story about things that happen. But here's a story about American politics over that time period. In the 1950s, a substantial majority of Americans said that they trusted their government, right? These are a bunch of survey questions that have all been asked relatively consistently from the 1950s until now. I trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. Most politicians are honest. Most officials care about people like me. Most of the things government does is for the benefit of everyone. You can see that back in the 1950s, most Americans agreed with all of these sentiments, and over time, we have become much more cynical about our government. Now, I don't want to say that it's because of the movement of those little dots I just showed you. I don't know if that's the case or not. And we could argue it both ways, right? We could say that government perhaps has gotten worse and Americans trust government less, or we can say because Americans trust government less, government has become less responsive to us. But I want to tell you one thing that political scientists are pretty clear on about this era, which is this. There is a conventional wisdom that people tell about this pattern, and that conventional wisdom is wrong, okay? So the conventional wisdom that you probably learned when you were in school, if you went to school in like the 80s or 90s, people would point to these patterns and say, sometime in the late 1960s, early 1970s, Americans started to trust their government less. Why is that? And there are a couple of answers that Americans would give. They would say, oh, I think I actually have a slide that shows all of the scenarios, right? Actually, I have slides that show all these other patterns, right? So just trust me that this is the same thing, right? It's not only that we began to trust government less, right? It's that we trusted the individual pieces of government less, right? There's trust in the judiciary, trust in the president, trust in our legislative branch. All of this stuff declines. Trust in everything in government declines, right? You look at all of these things in government that we have less confidence in. It's not just government, right? It is newspapers, television stations, banks, organized labor, and so on. So all of these things collapse at the same time. So this is the story that I got told when I was in school, right? Why did this happen? Well, people would be like, oh, Richard Nixon, right? When a president gets impeached, everybody gets real cynical about the political system, right? That must be why. Or they would say, well, it's not just Nixon, right? It's all this other stuff that was going on, right? It's Woodstock, it's the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., it's the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy or Malcolm X, it's the Vietnam War. This is the story that Americans told ourselves about this problem. And in a way, it's understandable that we would have told ourselves this story, right? Especially if you lived through this stuff, right? You saw this happen, right? You were like, oh, well, Americans were really upset about Vietnam and so on. But what I want to tell you is that this story is not true. And it's not true for a few reasons, and those reasons are important. First of all, to go back to the slides that I kind of zipped over earlier, it doesn't really make any sense that we would become cynical about every kind of government institution because of these political events, right? And you see this happening, right? So Richard Nixon, right, resigns from office. Should that make us more suspicious of newspapers? I don't know, right? Newspapers are kind of part of this story. Should it make us more suspicious of business, of banks, of schools? It's hard to tell that story, right? Something else is going on. It turns out we got suspicious of pretty much all political institutions in our society. And this is the most bewildering slide I will show you, right? So don't ask me to explain these statistical coefficients, but what I want to tell you is what this slide shows you is that in pretty much every democratic country in the world, people became more suspicious of their politicians at that same time, right? In Iceland, in France, in Canada, in New Zealand, and in Norway. So you can't tell a nifty little story like, oh, it was Vietnam, or oh, it was Richard Nixon. Those American-centric stories don't really tell you exactly what is going on. So what is going on? Well, here's what I would propose. A lot of other stuff changes in the 1960s and changes everywhere in the world. Among the most important things are these. The communication technology that we use changed, right? Instead of reading the news in newspapers, we watch news stories on television. And gradually over this time, the news that we get, first it's on television, then it's on cable television, then it's on the internet, and so on. So the technology that we use to understand politics changes during this time. And the other striking change that happened in pretty much every democracy during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and so on, is that people learned more stuff, right? People became better educated. The percentage of people with college degrees, the percentage of people with high school degrees, the percentage of people who are literate, and so on, increased in all of these places at about the same time. Now, if you sit down and think about that, maybe story number one was exciting, but this is a little bit depressing, because what this suggests is that during this time, we became better at understanding our political system, and we saw more about it. And we responded with disgust. And I can come up with analogies for this, right? My best analogy about this is this. Have you ever watched C-SPAN? Right? C-SPAN is a noble endeavor, right? Let's watch what goes on in Congress. But, unless you're like a politics geek like me, you watch and you're like, what are these guys doing, right? They're droning on all day. I don't understand what they're talking about. As Americans, and people in other countries too, began to see all of this stuff, they perhaps started to think, oh, our politicians are not that special, they don't necessarily know what they're doing, and so on. So the more we learn about our political institutions, the less faith we have in those institutions. Now this is a problem, because my first story suggested that all of these things are fixable, right? That the system can repair itself. This story suggests that it's a lot harder to fix the problems that we have. And to give you an example of what this means, let me show you a picture of my hometown, Worcester, Massachusetts. I wish I could capture this accurately, right? What I was trying to show in this picture, I took out of front of my car, and I'm driving down the street on Pleasant Street in Worcester. If you know, like the West Tatnick area of Worcester, which is not real far from where I live, you drive down Pleasant Street from Tatnick Square, and there are all of these beautiful old churches, right? There's an Episcopal church, there's like a Congregational church, there are a bunch of other churches. Now my family, we're not really church-going people, but I grew up going to a Presbyterian church, and so to humor me when my kids were little, right, we would all go to church on Christmas every year. It was always like a different place, right? We didn't really find a place in Worcester that enamored them. And every time we walk into these magnificent buildings, they'd be mostly empty, right? And the people who were there would look at us and be like, hey, look, little kids, right, who want to go to our church, right? My kids felt weird about this, right? This, I think, in some ways is a metaphor for this, right? Our politics is full of these venerable old institutions that once really meant something, right? That used to be full of people who understood what it was to do their job, right? What it was to be a member of Congress, what it was like to be a part of the news media, right? These beliefs still are there, but these institutions don't function quite the way they used to, right? They're largely empty. And I guess, my response, when we go to these places on Christmas Eve was, we look around and be like, well, good on those people who are still keeping this place running, like keeping the lights on, making sure that services still happen. That is wonderful for them. But we don't really have that feeling when we look at our Congress, right? Or when we look at, say, Democratic or Republican Party organizations, right? We don't say, well, this organization is a fraction of what it was. All right, for those people, I'm going to dive in, right? I'm going to do stuff. Instead, most Americans look at these things and they say, we need something else, right? Let's give up on this. So that, I think, is our natural response, right? When we see institutions that are not functioning well, we give up, right? We don't put in the work to make them better. And it's hard to tell people otherwise. I tell this to my students. I hope I don't offend the readers of the Worcester newspaper here, but the Worcester newspaper used to be like a big enterprise, right? They used to have staff from everywhere. It used to be a very high-quality newspaper. Over the years, their budget has gotten cut. They've gotten bought by companies in Florida or wherever, and it's not nearly as good, I think, as it once was. And it's hard to make it better, right? Because to make it better, what would we have to do? We'd have to all subscribe to it, right? And it's hard to do that, right? It's hard to say, like, let's make these institutions better. So that's where I'd leave you with that story, right? This is another story about our polarization. And this story suggests that we don't have a neat roadmap, right? The things we need to do to rebuild these institutions, it's very counterintuitive. It's very counterintuitive to think about doing this stuff. But this story suggests that maybe we haven't been here before, right? When we had problems as a country in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we still had vibrant institutions that connected Americans to each other. And all these things are missing today. So what lessons can we learn from these two stories that I've told you? Maybe we've been here before, right? Maybe we know how to fix things. Or maybe we haven't been here before, and maybe there's not a way to fix things. And then finally, maybe we should be real suspicious of people who have good stories to tell about what's going on. And I want to use this as a way to pivot into contemporary politics. One way I think about contemporary politics is this. We're at a complicated moment, in part because there is a belief on the part of both political parties that something radical is about to happen. Democrats, I think, have thought for 20 years or so now that the future is democratic. There's a book published in 2002 called The Emerging Democratic Majority, which argued that young people are democratic, that America is becoming more racially diverse, and non-white people are disproportionately democratic, that sooner or later Democrats were going to win, and they were going to win like forever, right? And this has made Democrats, I think, kind of wait out the time, right, try to think about what's going on in the future. But it has led to this sort of argument on the part of Republicans that stuff has to happen fast, right, that the window on the Republican Party is closing, that sooner or later the electorate will change so that Republicans wind up as a permanent majority. This story is unhealthy, right? It's unhealthy in part because it's not true. We see this happening already, right? The Republican Party, despite what all Democrats will say, somehow is becoming more racially diverse. Republicans are figuring out how to reach out to non-white people, and that emerging Democratic majority that is supposed to happen is not necessarily on its way. And our political system, the way our political system works, suggests that it's not necessarily going to show up. So there's an example of a story that I think is harmful to our politics. And so I present that to you not as like a full-fledged counter to those first two stories, but to say that we can use stories. We can use stories to help us understand politics, but we should not rely exclusively on stories about politics in a way that is detrimental to our ability to understand new things, to just get along with each other. So, where does all of that leave you and me? Well, I guess in my role as, as in the introduction, Donna mentioned that I run this thing called the National Institute for Civil Discourse Research Network. And what that is a bunch of academics from a variety of different fields who study the way we talk to each other, right? How can we make politics work a little bit better? How can we make politics a little more civil? How can we find ways to deal with people who are different from us? And so one way to think about this is to understand that we all have stories that we tell about politics, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But we shouldn't get too attached to the stories that we've got. So in the spirit of offering you some things you can use to create a story that works, I want to propose a few things. First of all, this guy, I think I have just one book here that I do want to recommend that you read. This guy, Robert Talisse, who's a philosopher at Vanderbilt University, is part of our network. And he has, I think, a really wonderful story, which is this. We need to stop talking about politics so much, right? And it's like a weird thing, right? I wind up, at these events where I'm like, hi, I'm a professor of political science. I would like you to not think about the things I say. But Talisse's argument is that the other striking thing about America of the 1950s, 1960s, and so on, was that party identity was not hardwired into the way people were. And that we didn't necessarily connect with each other first and foremost as Democrats or Republicans. So Jalisa's argument is that the way to fix politics is to try to find non-political ways to connect with other people. And these can be, in some ways kind of silly, right? Join a bird watching club or join some other organization that is fundamentally not about politics. And you might get little tidbits in the course of doing that. You may all be familiar with Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which was written a while back. In some ways, that was Putnam's argument as well. Putnam's argument is that during times in American history where we've been less polarized, we connected with each other to things like bowling leagues, right? Other kinds of activities. So one important way to think about politics is to not think about it, right? To think about other ways that we can engage with people and to try to find ways to engage with diverse sorts of folks about things other than politics. That's becoming increasingly difficult in America today because our communities today are by and large segregated according to ideology. The school I teach at, Clark University, I got to say there's not a whole lot of Republican students at Clark, and for a time I was really proud of this. I was the faculty advisor to the Clark Democrats and the Clark Republicans, and I thought that was neat. Right? But the Clark Republicans have sadly gone away, right? So it's hard to find those places in American society, but we should try, right? We should try to do that in person, right? Find ways to connect with people as people in our communities. Some other things I want to offer to you just as resources, though, are to become aware. There are a lot of different programs that you can connect with nationally that will help you engage with other sorts of folks. So if you want to find out a little bit more about the organization that I'm in, the National Institute for Civil Discourse, we have a variety of different programs that I'm sure we'd all love for you to get involved in. Among them, I want to highlight this program, Common Sense American, which is an online community where people gather information on different pieces of legislation, talk with each other about solutions. The online forums are curated so that you'd be talking with people from another region of the country, you'd be talking with people who have very different kinds of views. But we have a number of other programs that are designed to bring people together to talk about political differences and to talk about where the nation ought to go. Living Room Conversations is another organization like this. Again, Living Room Conversations has virtual gatherings that you can attend. They have in-person gatherings that you can attend. Curated discussions of political issues that are designed to bring people together with different points of view. Braver Angels is another organization like this. I've done a few things with them. In some ways, it's a bigger lift. Braver Angels has this whole sort of complicated philosophy of how, you basically have to learn a little bit about their philosophy of having discussions, right? But their discussions wind up being good because in many ways they become about how you can have discussions, right? So it's not just that you're talking about political issues, but you're spending some time with other people, learning all of the techniques that you can develop. So you can take these things offline, you can take these things in your community, so you can develop facilitation skills in how to talk about controversial issues with others. Just show you quickly some other things. I mean, these things all do kind of the same thing. The Village Square is another organization that does this, that focuses on religious differences and racial differences. The Renew America movement is an organization where citizens get together and discuss candidates whom they might support. It's founded by this guy, Evan McMullen, who is currently running for Congress as an independent in Utah. Evan McMullen is a former Republican, but has pledged that if he should win the Senate race, he will not caucus with either party. And although he's involved in the formation of this organization, the organization involves a lot of other people. And so it's all about learning about candidates around the country who are willing to take a pledge that they will not engage in some of the nastier things that people on both sides have done. Let's see, what else can I say? Some other things that are worth checking into. All Sides is a really great journalistic forum for learning about issues. What they do is they provide a curated set of news headlines that you can check out if you want to figure out whether the information that you are getting has some sort of bias. I did this with my students last week. We spent some time looking at coverage of the John Fetterman-Mehmet Oz Senate debate in Pennsylvania, and we spent some time trying to figure out how are right-leaning media sources talking about this debate? How are left-leaning media sources talking about this? What are the different ways in which other Americans understand this debate that went on or understand the characteristics of this race. And that's not so much to change your mind as to help you understand that other people who saw this thing are going to get very different kinds of information about what it meant. A couple other groups that do the same thing. Divided We Fall is an organization that you can actually, I've written a few things for them in the past. Divided We Fall is an organization that creates structured conversations about hot-button political issues. I think the last thing I wrote for them was about what we should expect in the upcoming midterm election, and they pitted me up against a guy who disagreed with me on a lot of political issues, right? And we kind of tried to figure out what we had in common, right? We had 3 or 4 iterations of our kind of partisan talking points and tried to distill out of that, right, what set of facts we had in common. So again, it's a way that you can read this in part to get perspectives on what people who disagree with you think, but also to understand that all of the information you get has some sort of biases and to understand what those biases. I also do a little bit of work with Unite America, which is an organization that is devoted to trying to figure out other ways in which we can conduct elections. So I'm in the middle of this complicated process for them, trying to figure out what's going on in Alaska. Alaska, as you may have heard, has this crazy new election system where people from both parties run in the primary. The top 4 candidates that emerge from the primary then face a ranked choice general election. And they have high hopes for this, right? This is supposed to make Democrats and Republicans get along with each other. It's supposed to prevent people from nasty attack ads on each other. And it's supposed to stop people on the extremes of either party.
Do they have rank order voting there too?
Yes, they do. They will, yeah. So I'm not sure it works, right? But it's worth studying, right? It's worth studying whether this kind of stuff works. There are a lot of different political reforms that get talked about. I think many of those reforms have more negatives than positives, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A if you want. But it's important to study all of this stuff, to study the diversity of election systems in our states, to try to figure out if anybody is doing all of this stuff right. 2 or 3 more things, then I'll give you my punchline here. My politics, I think, skews a little bit to the left in general, which is why I find it really important to find out what smart conservatives are thinking. So the R Street Institute is my favorite place to go to find really intelligent policy analysis from conservatives who want to try to convince Democrats or liberals that they're not entirely wrong. So one instance of a variety of places where it's really important to try to figure out who are the people who you disagree with who nonetheless you want to have a conversation with. So R Street is one of those organizations that I would recommend. And a final thing, this is from last year, but the date will be roughly the same. The National Week of Conversation is an event that is conducted by all of these groups working in common. All of the groups I've shown you are part of what's called the Bridge Alliance, which is this national consortium of groups that are all in some ways addressed to trying to bridge political divides in the country. They all get together and create this thing that you can be part of, the National Week of Conversation that happens at the end of April every year. It's a wonderful event, in part just because you get to find a way to connect with somebody like on the other side of the country who you would never, ever meet otherwise. So it's an interesting thing to kind of put on your calendar and keep in mind. So let me close with a couple qualifications. One of the most interesting things about all of these organizations is that they have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to sell their story. So I was involved in one of these analyses recently, right? This organization called Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement commissioned a survey of different words that we use in talking about politics. And I think the most striking thing, and I think the most problematic thing for thinking about all of this stuff is, looking around this room here, we're all older than like my students are. I guess I can say that. I think that we all bring with us some biases about the political system. I don't know that I grew up in this utopian society or anything like that. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1970s and 1980s. And if you grew up in a big American city at the time, it was kind of crummy, right? I mean, many American cities were in a state of disrepair. Smog was everywhere. I have pictures I show my students, right? I go through all this trust stuff, and then I'll say, look, according to a lot of measures, America was really better in the 1970s, right? We were less polarized. Our Congress did stuff. We were a more equal country. things are pretty good. And then I show them this picture of the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. And I'm like, but you know what? I don't know if they want to go back there. Right? So that, I think, is the problem in thinking about all of this stuff, right? That the America we grew up in is not the America that people in their teens and 20s are growing up in. And quite honestly, when we spend lots of time telling younger people, oh, you know, if only we got along like Americans did in the 1950s or 1970s, we lose that audience, okay? So one of the most striking things that I want to recommend to you, you can download this report, right, the American Civic Language Report, is to think about how you talk about politics with other folks. And I don't just mean younger folks, but I do run into this problem. You know, I'll talk to my students and I'll say, oh, you know, I work for this place called the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And my students will raise their hands and say, civil discourse is stupid, right? And I'll be like, okay, I understand your point of view, but also you raised your hand, you waited to be called on, right? You were behaving in a civil way, right? So it's not that my students want to be rude and uncivil, but there's something about the way I talk to them about that turns them off. So I would recommend that you think a lot about the language that gets used in talking about this stuff, whether it alienates younger people, whether it alienates people with whom you disagree with. It's not like I have a basic story here, right? But there are a lot of findings to this, right? That non-white people tend to interpret a lot of the words that we use in talking about getting along very differently than white people. Younger people tend to interpret these things differently than older folks. And likewise, you know, if you are liberal in your politics, you probably recognize that your conservative friends use different language in talking about democracy or other kinds of things. And that sometimes when you go and you say, like, building civic institutions, right, there are other people, listen, he's liberal, you know, why would you talk like that, right? So it's important to think about how we can use language to include people rather than to exclude people, and to think about the ways in which we can talk about our political discourse in a way that emphasizes that we're not trying to shut people out, we're not trying to make it a thing that older, wealthier, whiter people are all about. So those, I think, are some important considerations to go through there. So, to briefly summarize, all of these organizations that are focused on are groups that try to engage differences in a way that still allows us to agree on facts, that are supposed to be about creating community across generations, across political lines, to bring people in rather than casting them out. And in some ways to build community that's not just about politics, but about something else in community that can last. This is hard stuff to do. And again, I want to emphasize in closing here, all of this is about rebuilding our civic institutions, trying to make our political parties work better, trying to make other kinds of institutions, right, the associations we belong to, things like the League of Women Voters, things like our public schools, our public libraries, our religious institutions, about making them better or making them fit the 21st century. It's a real challenge, right? But it's something that I think we really need to take up because, again, to get back to my two stories, I don't know that we can expect our politics to snap back to the way things were. I don't know if we really want that. I don't know if our institutions, if there's enough there to really help them recover. But I think that's part of the challenge that we have in front of us. So, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. That's all I got to say.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was fabulous. You took us from the 1800s and all that facial hair to today. It was terrific. So, are there questions? Thank you, David. Questions from anybody? Yes. Oh.
I'm wondering if there is any country in the world that you would hold as an example of where we would want to go.
Well, I mean, we can't be a country other than who we are. I mean, you've seen there are a lot of different analyses people provide, right? That countries that tend to be more equal economically tend to also have higher levels of democracy. there's an ongoing debate about whether those are also countries that are just more homogeneous, right? Whether homogeneity is something that enables countries to survive. My wife is sitting here in the back, and I promised I wouldn't depress her with this talk. But this is really the challenge in democracy, right? That you go back and you read the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a radical document because they proposed that you could have a democracy in a large, diverse country. That had never happened before the United States. Today, we see a number of other countries that seem to be functional democracies that are kind of diverse, right? Canada, for instance, seems to, in many ways, have a democracy that is working as well or better than ours in managing diversity. But we don't have any idea whether this sort of stuff lasts forever or any sort of magic story about how you can have a functioning democracy in a heterogeneous country. But, you know, it's up to us to prove we can, right? I guess that's the optimistic story.
Yes.
I don't want to accuse you of being a Pollyanna, but I think you may be, and I commend you for your approach, somewhat more optimistic than some of us are. John Meacham, who you may recognize, he's one of my favorite on-air historians, on MSNBC the other night, said he was very concerned about the upcoming midterm elections. And I myself, maybe for the last 4 or 5 years, have been increasingly, even though I'm no expert on German history, have been increasingly concerned that I understand more and more as we proceed what happened in Germany in the 1930s. Meacham said he saw this election, this midterm thing, as pivotal. I'm looking at the reports of what McCarthy is planning if he gets to be the Speaker of the House, and it really frightens the hell out of me. So I just wish you'd sort of comment where do you stand in terms of where Meacham and where I stand on this?
Well, it's funny. You know, at Clark last night, we had Steve Levitsky from Harvard come give a talk. I'm sorry, not Steve Levitsky, it's Dan Ziblatt. I get that confused. Dan Ziblatt came and gave a talk.
We were there.
All right, yep, I was too. I don't know why I flipped the authors around. Anyway, Dan Ziblatt is the co-author of a book called How Democracies Die. And I came away from that talk thinking, wow, he's more of an optimist than I am. But Ziblatt's point, I think, is worth emphasizing. Ziblatt's argument is that old democracies don't die the way the German democracy died, right? The German democracy died because the German democracy was only a couple decades old. Historically, that is the way democracies, when democracies fundamentally collapse, right? They're generally young, unstable democracies. But Ziblatt's story should actually concern us anyway. His argument is that when older democracies start to experience problems, they just become worse democracies, right? That a democracy can continue to become worse. And that's part of his story about what's going on right now. And I guess, if you want to invite me to get pessimistic, I would say this. We're gonna, you asked for it, right? We're gonna be in for a rough couple of years, I think, right? All of the sorts of political stuff that has characterized divided government over the last several years, right? The inability to pass a budget, impeachments and, investigations of presidents. We're in for that over the next couple of years. In the long run, I think the optimist story is that I don't know that there is any reason to expect that the kinds of things that will be done to our democracy over the next couple of years are irreversible, right? Democracies, according to the Ziblatt story, right, they can get worse, but when democracies kind of slowly get worse, that means we can turn them around and make them a little bit better, right? So if a democracy doesn't collapse the way Germany does, we as citizens have recourse. What concerns me a little bit more, I think, though, is that The real problem, I would say, in our politics is not our federal government, it is the states. Right? American states have always been less democratic than the federal government. All the things that you fear at the federal level are things that have been done in places like North Carolina and Wisconsin and other states. I don't see great solutions to that. I don't know that that's a thing I would pin on either party. I think states that tend to be controlled by Democrats have had problems just like states controlled by Republicans. But it means that the levers for political action are really available to us, right? There are things that we can try to implement at the state level. And again, it's a heavy lift, right? It's a heavy lift to even ask people in Massachusetts, name your state representative, right? But again, it's a thing that we can fix. Right, so that's, I guess, my kind of optimistic story, right? I think, when you see a country that slides into dictatorship or a country that seems to have become fundamentally undemocratic, like, I don't know what I would do if I was living in Russia now, but I don't think I would have any hope of changing the system, and I think it's realistic to have that hope in America, even if things get a lot worse.
So what you're saying, and this is my hope too, that there are enough guardrails still in place. In other words, the fact that we have an educated population, that for the most part. Now, I worry a little bit about those Republicans in the Congress who should have known better, who voted not to certify the election. That's kind of scary stuff, but that there are enough people out there. There are enough people like Liz Cheney, who I vehemently disagree with on her politics, but who had the courage to stand up and say, when we talk about democracy, this is something really important. There are enough guardrails out there, enough people who have been raised in the spirit of democracy and solving our problems this way, that we can still survive. And that's my hope.
Yeah, I think people use the guardrail analogy. I think the analogy I would use is roads, right? We have roads that we can use to get places. Sometimes they need repaving, sometimes there's potholes, right? Sometimes you got a dirt road you got to struggle on, but you can always fix it, right? Whereas if you think about guardrails, right, you go over the guardrail, you plunge down the cliff, right? I don't know that our politics involves guardrails, but it involves a lot of roads that we can take to get where we want to go. We can fix them, we can make them better, we can navigate them somewhat even when they get worse. I guess that's the analogy I would use.
Ellen.
You did a nice job of summarizing, good times, bad times, and how things changed and so on. But if I were going to tell the same story, one item I would include would be the Civil War. And I'm struck that you didn't include it. So I'm wondering why.
Well, in part, I'm driven by this story about polarization and data and all of that sort of stuff. The Civil War was something that I think, when you read stuff from the founders, right, it had to happen, right? This was a contradiction that was built into American politics. I don't know that the Civil War was a surprise. It's fundamentally true that our nation has always had problems dealing with race. I don't know that there are credible arguments out there that there is a Civil War-like thing looming, right, in the way that the initial Civil War was. I do know a lot of people who've told stories about polarization, instability, all that sort of stuff with reference, say, to the way members of Congress treated each other in the run-up to the Civil War. So, I can certainly tell that story. But what I find, I guess, valuable in these stories is that I think I think in some ways the late 19th century story tells us, how shall I say this? It seems to me to parallel a little bit more about where we are in our society, the patterns in terms of where votes are coming from, which states there are, and so on. So that's one way to think about that. Another way to think about it is that I did tell you a Civil War story, right? The story about American politics of the late 19th century is a story about the Civil War, right? It's about America's incomplete effort to deal with race. And that's something I didn't get into a whole lot, but that's part of why the story I've told you about the late 19th century winds up being fodder for debate among people who look at American political history. Is there those who argue that America succeeded in solving this problem because they abandoned the cause of African Americans in the South, right? That Reconstruction was given up, that progressives gave up on trying to address issues of race. I think that's a little bit too harsh on progressives, right? I think there were a lot of people who were involved in reform movements who also cared about race, but it was dealt with, it was not dealt with enough, which is one reason why we should expect this sort of conflict to recur. So it's kind of a half answer to your question.
Good, thank you.
I have a question. You touched on it a little bit about communication and the way information is dispersed. And from my experience, I've seen that we can't even agree on facts anymore. And people, when I talk to them about, well, where'd you get that data? Primary sources. They don't know what I'm talking about. And so, I think fundamentally, if you can't even agree on what happened, and everybody's watching the same thing on TV, and you can't even agree that the same thing happened, I don't know where you go from there. Do you have any suggestions or?
So I can give you two answers that fit, I think, neatly with the two stories that I've told. One of them is that, those of us who grew up in, mid to late 20th century, grew up in an unusual time, right? We grew up at a time when there was a such thing as professional journalists who had a code of ethics and a belief in going after the truth. It was a real innovation of the 20th century to create these sort of professional standards, not just for journalists, but for doctors and lawyers. Pretty much every occupation in American society established some sort of professional code of ethics in the 20th century. And we see all of that stuff declining today. And in many ways, that's taking us back to where America was in the 19th century, right? Where news was expected to be partisan, right? So one way to think about that is that we were able to build that sort of thing before. But another, again, perhaps more complicated way to do this is that, I don't know, when I was a kid, I had it easy, right? There was one newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio that showed up in our kitchen every morning. If I wanted to read the news, that was what I read. And the Cleveland newspaper was a better newspaper then than it is now, but it still was not the greatest newspaper ever. But I didn't have to decide my news consumption strategy, and today we do, right? And this is, I think, a bigger problem for younger people, right? I spent all of this time in my classes trying to tell my students that they should develop a strategy for how they read news, right? That they should go to these places that I mentioned, places like All Sides or Divided We Fall, that nobody's going to do this for them, right? That they've got to go out there and figure out what the competing arguments are and issues, what a reliable news source is. So we've all got to train ourselves. I think we can play a role in kind of training other people, but again, it's not easy, and it certainly is not easy to go to somebody we disagree with and say, you know what, your facts are wrong, right? That's a hard thing.
Well, there's a primary
do.
source, data from science, for example.
Yeah, that's all stuff that, is part of all these conversation groups that I've focused on, right? Sort of helping people to try to figure out where their conversations are starting, right? What fact do you want to start your conversation with? And if you approach it the right way, people will often be agreeable, at the least for saying, like, let's all agree that we are starting here, and let's agree on a strategy for building from that. So we can do that as individuals if we seek out other individuals who want to do that, right? I don't know how easily any of these things scale up, right? I don't know that I can say, okay, I could sit down with a bunch of people and we could agree on a strategy. I don't know what that says for how the United States can do this, right? Arguably, the more of these conversations we have, the better off we are. But when we're talking about a country of, 300 million people, it's hard to know whether any of these efforts scale up in a way that makes a huge difference. I hope they do.
More questions?
If no one else?
Anybody
Okay.
else?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I don't
you're up, kid.
You talked about us all getting our news and sources, and you talked about your hometown newspaper. I remember there's a story out there, you're probably familiar with, some of you. Roger Ailes, the guy who used to run Fox News, maintains that if Fox News had been around when Richard Nixon was in difficulty, Richard Nixon would have never been hounded from office. I mean, I suspect I may be like some of you. My online news is from MSNBC. I read the Boston Globe. When Rush Limbaugh was around, I used to dip in once every month or two. I could only take 5 or 10 minutes of him. I disagree with him so profoundly. And I think they use the term stovepiping. We all get our facts from a different place. And indeed, one of the interesting things is, I'd be interested, maybe just by a show of hands, how many people here today consider themselves leaning Republican? I don't know. Are we a mixed group here? Or are we all Democrats who lean Republican Democrat? Or are we like me, a jerk-knee Democrat? I mean, I confess I'm a liberal progressive Democrat and very proud of it, so okay.
Well, I guess, this is one of these things that makes these conversations difficult, right? It's hard to naturally select an audience that has, say, representative of the American people, right? That does have substantial room for ideological disagreement. We have to seek these things out, right? Which is not easy to do, right? So,
I think this will be the last question.
Yeah, this has to do with news and news sources. The nature of news has changed so much. I think about the role of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. Fox News couldn't exist before we abandoned the Fairness Doctrine, right? I mean, we're confronted now with all this stuff that is called news that's really entertainment and isn't news, but people believe that it's news. And I mean, how do you think that plays into it? When we talk about news sources, it's more complicated now because there are things that pass for news, and if you don't know any better, you might believe that it's news, even though it's not.
well, that's. I mean, maybe this is a Pollyanna-ish thing to say, but this is America of the 19th century, right? Go and read newspapers of the 1840s or something like that.
Well, I know
it's
what they were
trash,
like.
right?
There's a reason they changed.
Right, there is, but I think some of this is on us, right? Newspapers in America are struggling.
Well, they're all in decline.
They are, but I mean, it's a collective action issue, right? There are things that we can do, right? There are all sorts of wonderful, starving nonprofit organizations trying to provide local news coverage of stuff.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
And,
And there are a lot of good online journalists. They
Right.
are, that does.
Right. I mean, they're starved for resources, in
Well-
part because most of us don't have the time or effort to put money into that.
Right.
But we can push our governments to give money to that. We can choose to commit money to that. It's hard to do, right? I mean, there's a lot of work that Americans have to do to fix these things. And part of the challenge is that Americans don't necessarily want to, right? It's a lot easier to go online and look up incendiary headlines or to pull our news from, whatever disreputable social media friends we have, rather than to try to find ways to see good local news coverage in our communities.
Well, there's a lot of it out there. I think that because other forms of news can exist, if people don't understand the difference, I personally think it was a real mistake to abandon the Fairness Doctrine, and I would like to see something like that come back, so that journalists can't just say or quote journalists can't just say whatever they feel like saying.
I wouldn't disagree with you on that.
I'm sorry?
I wouldn't disagree with you on that.
Thank you. All righty. Well, thank you so much. But now, yes. So now it's time to ask my question to you. What do you think, what kinds of programs could the League sponsor to help us get through all this? Do you have any ideas of What would be good? Someone besides Gibbs, right now. Anyone else?
Here's
Do we want to?
Do you want me to type it
Yeah,
out?
we thought we'd type things up here, your ideas. So,
All right.
wait just a minute
Take over
till
that.
Thank you.
she,
All right. All right. You can start talking while I get this.
mine isn't
Yeah.
that complicated.
there you go.
There we go. All
Yeah.
right.
Mine is mostly about revisiting campaign finances. And I know years ago we had talked about that in the league, and everything has changed. And so I think there might be something to address and inform the public again, or come up with a consensus.
Okay. Other ideas?
Maybe you could try to facilitate a discussion based on one of the strategies from one of the groups that was mentioned tonight, which would have you have a more diverse group of people and different opinions, and actually model it for people, if possible.
It's a great idea. Anybody else? All right, well, you've given us some marching orders. We'll take a look at the, okay, Gibbs, you get 2 minutes.
I don't need 2 minutes. I don't know about the rest of you, but I found as Professor Boatwright proceeded, there were all kinds of things pinging off in my brain. And it struck me that a panel, including Professor Boatwright, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 others, academicians, and maybe even a politician or 2, a kind of round table talking about the kind of issue we were dealing with this evening. This whole thing, because I mean, we are, regardless of how this goes, we're in a very sticky time. So,
Okay, well, what a great evening. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Rob. That was terrific.